Continuing Alexander the Great, from Plutarch's Lives, translated by John Dryden, revised by Arthur Hugh Clough. Alexander was but 20 years old when his father was murdered, and succeeded to a kingdom beset on all sides with great dangers and rancorous enemies, for not only the barbarous nations that bordered on Macedonia were impatient of being governed by any but their own native princes. Well, it should matter more who the just rulers are, right? But Philip likewise, though he had been victorious over the Grecians, yet, as the time had not been sufficient for him to complete his conquest and accustom them to his sway, had simply left all things in a general disorder and confusion. It seemed to the Macedonians a very critical time, and some would have persuaded Alexander to give up all thought of retaining the Grecians in subjection by force of arms, and rather to apply himself to win back by gentle means the allegiance of tribes who were designing revolt, and try the effect of indulgence in arresting the first motions towards revolution. But he rejected this counsel as weak and timorous, and looked upon it to be more prudent to secure himself by resolution and magnanimity than by seeming to truckle to any, to encourage all to trample on him. In pursuit of this opinion, he reduced the barbarians to tranquility, and put an end to all fear of war from them by a rapid expedition into their country as far as the river Danube. So you see, they're up into towards Germany. He gave Sarmas, king of the Trebalians, an entire overthrow, and hearing the Thebans were in revolt and the Athenians in correspondence with them, he immediately marched through the pass of Thermopylae, saying that to Demosthenes, who had called him a child while he was in Illyria, and in that country of the Trebalians, and a youth when he was in Thessaly, he would appear a man before the walls of Athens, when he came to Thebes, to show how willing he was to accept of their repentance for what was past. He only demanded of them Phoenix and Prothetes, the authors of the rebellion, and proclaimed a general pardon to those who would come over to him. But when the Thebans merely retorted by demanding Philotas and Antipater to be delivered into their hands, and by a proclamation on their part invited all who would assert the liberty of Greece. Keep the C as a K. Okay. The liberty of the Greek liberty to come over to them. He presently applied himself to make them feel the last extremities of war. The Thebans indeed defended themselves with a zeal and courage beyond their strength, being much outnumbered by their enemies. But when the Macedonian garrison sailed out upon them from the citadel, they were so hemmed in on all sides that the greater part of them fell in battle, and the city itself, being taken by storm, was sacked and razed. Alexander's hope being that so severe an example might terrify the rest of the Greeks into obedience, and also to gratify the hostility of his confederates, the Phocians and the Plataeans, so that, except the priests and some few who had heretofore been the friends and connections of the Macedonians, the family of the poet Pindar, and those who were known to have opposed the public vote for the war, all the rest, to the number of 30,000, were publicly sold for slaves, and it is computed that upwards of 6,000 were put to the sword, Among other calamities that befell the city, it happened that some Thracian soldiers, having broke into the house of a matron of high character and repute, named Timoclea, their captain, after he had used violence with her to satisfy his avarice as well as lust, asked her if she knew of any money concealed, to which she readily answered she did, and bade him follow her into a garden, where she showed him a well, into which she told him, upon the taking of the city, she had thrown what she had of most value. The greedy Thracian, presently stooping down to view the place where he thought the treasure lay, she came behind him and pushed him into the well, and then flung great stones in upon him till she had killed him, thus doing the right thing, right? After which, when the soldiers led her away, bound to Alexander, her very mien and gait showed her to be a woman of dignity, and of a mind no less elevated, not betraying the least sign of fear or astonishment. And when the king asked her who she was, I am, said she, the sister of Theogenes, who fought the battle of Charonea with your father Philip, and fell there in command for the liberty of the Greeks. Alexander, so surprised both at what she had done and what she said, that he could not choose but give her and her children their freedom to go whither they pleased. Well, she was just defending herself against a intruder, right? So after this, he received the Athenians into favor, although they had shown themselves so much concerned at the calamity of Thebes that, out of sorrow, they omitted the celebration of the mysteries, and entertained those who escaped with all possible humanity, whether it were like the lion, that his passion was now satisfied, or that after an example of extreme cruelty he had a mind to appear merciful. It happened well for the Athenians, for he had not only forgave them all past offences, but bade them look to their affairs with vigilance, remembering that if he should miscarry, they were likely to be the arbiters of Greece. Because I know you say the Greek. I guess we say, is it Italian? Is that why we don't say it right? Certain it is, too, that in aftertime he often repented of his severity to the Thebans, and his remorse had such an influence on his temper as to make him, ever after, less rigorous to all others. He imputed also the murder of Cletus, which he committed in his wine, and the unwillingness of the Macedonians to follow him against the Indians, by which his enterprise and glory was left imperfect, to the wrath and vengeance of Bacchus, the protector of Thebes. And it was observed that whatsoever any Theban who had the good fortune to survive this victory asked of him, he was sure to grant without the least difficulty. Well, if something's happening, why is it Bacchus, right? Remember, by this time, we're actually running into the Gospel of John. The text that the Gospel of John is based upon, which is about Bacchus. Soon after, the Grecians, being assembled at the Isthmus, declared their resolution of joining with Alexander in the war against the Persians, and proclaimed him their general. While he stayed here, many public ministers and philosophers came from all parts to visit him and congratulated him on his election. But contrary to his expectation, Diogenes of Sinope, who was then living at Corinth, thought so little of him that instead of coming to compliment him, he never so much as stirred out of the suburb called the Cranium, where Alexander found him lying along in the sun. When he saw so much company near him, he raised himself a little and about safe to look upon Alexander, and when he kindly asked him whether he wanted anything, "Yes," said he, I would have you stand from between me and the sun." Alexander was so struck at this answer, and surprised at the greatness of the man who had taken so little notice of him, that as he went away he told his followers, who were laughing at the moroseness of the philosopher, that if he were not Alexander, he would choose to be Diogenes. Then he went to Delphi to consult Apollo concerning the success of the war he had undertaken, and happened to come on one of the forbidden days, when it was esteemed improper to give any answer from the oracle. He sent messengers to desire the priestess to do her office, and when she refused, on the plea of a law to the contrary, he went up himself and began to draw her by force into the temple, until, tired and overcome with his importunity, "My son," she said, "thou art invincible." Alexander, taking hold of what she spoke, declared he had received such an answer as he wished for, and that it was needless to consult the entity any further. Now, do they mean God or Daemon? Certainly people worship the spirits or whatever, but among other prodigies that attended the departure of his army, the image of Orpheus at Libetra, made of cypress wood, was seen to sweat in great abundance, to the discouragement of many. But Aristander told him that, far from presaging any ill to him, it signified he should perform acts so important and glorious as would make the poets and musicians of future ages labor and sweat to describe and celebrate them. His army, by their computation, who make the smallest amount, consisted of 30,000 foot and 4,000 horse, and those who make the most of it speak but of 43,000 foot and 3,000 horse. Aristobulus says he had not a fund above 70 talents for their pay, nor had he more than 30 days' provision. If we may believe Durius, Ariscritius, Onesicritus tells us that he was 200 talents in debt, considering a talent is like a small person's weight in metal is quite a severe thing. Usually silver or gold, right? However narrow and disproportionable the beginnings of so vast an undertaking might seem to be, yet he would not embark his army until he had informed himself particularly what means his friends had to enable them to follow him, and supplied what they wanted by giving good forms to some, a village to one, and the revenue of some hamlet or harbor town to another, so that at last he had proportioned out or engaged almost all the royal property, which, giving Perdiccas an occasion to ask him what he would leave himself, he replied his hopes. Your soldiers, replied Perdiccas, will be your partners in those, and refused to accept of the estate he had assigned him. Some others of his friends did the like, but to those who willingly received or desired assistance of him, he liberally granted it, so far as his patrimony in Macedonia would reach, the most part of which was spent in these donations. With such vigorous resolutions, and his mind thus disposed, he passed the Hellespont, and at Troy sacrificed to Minerva, and honored the memory of the heroes who were buried there with solemn libations, especially Achilles, whose gravestone he anointed, and, with his friends, as the ancient custom is, ran naked about his sepulchre, and crowned it with garlands, declaring how happy he esteemed him, and having while he lived so faithful a friend, and when he was dead so famous a poet to proclaim his actions. While he was viewing the rest of the antiquities and curiosities of the place, being told he might see Paris's harp, if he pleased, he said that he thought it not worth looking on. I may at times, because Paris is how you pronounce the French, but that's not, it's something different. Please, he said, he thought worth looking on. But if he should be glad to see that of Achilles, to which he used to sing the glories and great actions of brave men, kind of a weird custom, running around a grave naked. The only nudity that people tend to encounter in graveyards is coming upon lovers in the between the tombstones or something. But some of these graveyards, what they put the police, is that why they put the police right next to a bunch of different graveyards? It seems a lot more common for the graveyard to be right next to the police station or something. In the meantime, Darius's captains, having collected large forces, were encamped on the further bank of the river Granicus, and it was necessary to fight, as it were, in the gate of Asia for an entrance into it. The depths of the river, with the unevenness and difficult ascent of the opposite bank, which was to be gained by main force, was apprehended by most, and some pronounced it to be an improper time to engage, because it was unusual for the kings of Macedonia to march with their forces in the month called Dacius. But Alexander broke through these scruples, telling them they should call it a second Artemisias, and when Parmenio advised him not to attempt anything that day, because it was late, he told him that he should disgrace the Hellespont should he fear the Granicus, and so without more saying, he immediately took the river with 13 troops of horse, and advanced against whole showers of darts thrown from the steep opposite side, which was covered with armed multitudes of the enemy's horse and foot, notwithstanding the disadvantage of the ground and the rapidity of the stream, so that the action seemed to have more frenzy and desperation in it than of prudent conduct. However, he persisted obstinately to gain the passage, and at last, with much ado, making his way up the banks, which were more extremely muddy and slippery, he had instantly to join in a mere confused hand-to-hand combat with the enemy before he could draw up his men, who were still passing over into any order, for the enemy pressed upon him with loud and warlike outcries, and charging horse against horse with their lances, and after they had broken and spent these, they fell to it with their swords, and Alexander, being easily known by his buckler and a large plume of white feathers on each side of his helmet, was attacked on all sides, yet escaped wounding, though his cuirass was pierced by a javelin in one of the joinings, and Asacus and Spithridates, 2 Persian commanders, falling upon him at once, he avoided the one of them and struck at Asacus, who had a good cuirass on, with such a force that, his spear breaking in his hand, he was glad to betake himself to his dagger. While they were thus engaged, Spithridates came up on one side of him, and raised himself upon his horse, gave him such a blow with his battle-axe on the helmet that he cut off the crest of it with one of his plumes, and the helmet was only just so far strong enough to save him that the edge of the weapon touched the hair of his head. But as he was about to repeat his stroke, Cletus, called the Black Cletus, prevented him by running him through the body with his spear. At the same time, Alexander dispatched Asacus with his sword. While the horse was thus dangerously engaged, the Macedonian phalanx passed the river, and the foot on each side advanced to fight. But the enemy, hardly sustaining the first onset, soon gave ground and fled, all but the mercenary Greeks, who, making a stand upon a rising ground, desired quarter, which Alexander, guided rather by passion than judgment, refused to grant, and charging them himself first, had his horse, not but another, killed under him, and this obstinacy of his to cut off these experienced, desperate men cost him the lives of more of his own soldiers than all the battle before. Besides those who were wounded, the Persians lost in this battle 20,000 foot and 2,500 horse. On Alexander's side, Aristobulus says that they were not wanting above 34, of whom 9 were foot soldiers, and in memory of them he caused so many statues of brass, Lysippus's making, to be erected, and that the Grecians might participate in the honor of his victory. He sent a portion of the spoils home to them, particularly to the Athenians, 300 bucklers, and upon all the rest he ordered this inscription to be set: Alexander, the son of Philip, and the Grecians, except the Lacedaemonians, won these from the barbarians who inhabit Asia. All the plate and purple garments and other things of the same kind that he took from the Persians, except a very small quantity, which he reserved for himself, he sent as a present to his mother. Now, we see that the aggressors sometimes have disadvantage because they're at being the aggressors. But certainly they thought it was their right to conquer as far out as they would. But if they didn't, it would have been seen as proof that maybe we did something wrong, right? And, you know, his approach to the oracle, well, the oracle's going to, you know, soothsayers and stuff, they're going to, if they don't know about you, they're going to look at your approach in making their judgments. This battle presently made a great change of affairs to Alexander's advantage, for Sardis itself, the chief seat of the barbarians' power in the maritime provinces, and many other considerable places were surrendered to him. Only Halicarnassus and Miletus stood out, which he took by force, together with the territory about them, after which he was a little unsettled in his opinion how to proceed. Sometimes he thought it best to find out Darius as soon as he could, and put all to the hazard of a battle. Another, while he looked upon it as a more prudent course, to make an entire reduction of the sea-coast, and not to seek the enemy till he had first exercised his power here and made himself secure of the resources of these provinces. While he was thus deliberating, when he was thus deliberating what to do, it happened that a spring of water near the city of Xanthus in Lycia, of its own accord, swelled over the banks and threw up a copper plate, upon the margin of which was engraved in ancient characters that the time would come when the Persian Empire should be destroyed by the Grecians. Encouraged by this accident, he proceeded to reduce the maritime parts of Cilicia and Phoenicia, and pass his army along the sea coasts of Pamphylia, and with such expedition that many historians have described and extolled it with that height of admiration, as if it were no less than a miracle, and an extraordinary event of divine favor, that the waves, which usually come rolling in violently from the main, and hardly ever leave so much as a narrow beach under the steep broken cliffs at any time uncovered, should on a sudden retire to afford him passage. Menander, in one of his comedies, alludes to this marvel when he says, "Was Alexander ever favored more? Each man I wish for meets me at my door. And should I ask for passage through the sea I doubt not would retire for me." But Alexander himself in his epistles mentions nothing unusual in this at all, but says he went from Phasaelis and passed through what they call the Ladders. At Phasaelis he stayed some time, and finding the statue of Theodectes, who was a native of this town and was now dead, erected in the marketplace, after he had supped, having drunk pretty plentifully, he went and danced about it, and crowned it with garlands, honoring not ungracefully in his sport the memory of a philosopher whose conversation he had formerly enjoyed when he was Aristotle's scholar. Then he subdued the Pisidians, who made head against him, and conquered the Phrygians, at whose chief city, Gordium, which is said to be the seat of the ancient Midas, he saw the famous chariot fastened with cords made of the rind of the cornel tree, with which whosoever should untie the inhabitants had a tradition that for him was reserved the empire of the world. Most authors tell the story that Alexander, finding himself unable to untie the knot, the ends of which were secretly twisted round and folded up within it, cut it asunder with his sword. But Aristobulus tells us it was easy for him to undo it by only pulling the pin out of the pole to which the yoke was tied, and afterwards drawing off the yoke itself from below. From hence he advanced into Paphlagonia and Cappadocia, both of which countries he soon reduced to obedience, and then hearing of the death of Memnon, the best commander Darius had upon sea coast, who, if he had lived, might, it was supposed, to have put many impediments and difficulties in the way of the progress of his arms, he was the rather encouraged to carry the war into the upper provinces of Asia. Darius was by this time upon his march from Susa, very confident, not only in the number of his men, which amounted to 600,000, but likewise in a dream, which the Persian soothsayers interpreted rather in flattery to him than according to the natural probability. He dreamed that he saw the Macedonian phalanx all on fire, and Alexander waiting on him, clad in the same dress which he himself had been used to wear when he was courier to the late king, after which, going into the temple of Belus, he vanished out of his sight. The dream would appear to have supernaturally signified to him the illustrious actions which the Macedonians were to perform, and that as he, from a courier's place, had risen to the throne, so Alexander should come to be master of Asia. I keep forgetting whether it's Asia or Asia, because they're not the same thing, right? That's what we now call Asia and Africa and all that. And not long, surviving his conquest, conclude his life with glory. Darius's confidence increased the more because Alexander spent so much time in Cilicia, which he imputed to his cowardice, but it was sickness that detained him there, which some say he contracted from his fatigues. Well, fatigue can make it easier to get sick, as I well know. Others from bathing in the river Cutnus, whose waters were exceedingly cold. However, it happened none of his physicians would venture to give him any remedies. They thought his case so desperate, and were so afraid of the suspicions and ill will of the Macedonians, if they should fail in the cure, till Philip, the Acarnanian, seeing how critical his case was, but relying on his own well-known friendship for him, resolved to try the last efforts of his art, and rather hazard his own credit and life, than suffer him to perish for want of physic, which he confidently administered to him, encouraging him to take it boldly if he desired a speedy recovery, in order to prosecute the war. At this very time, Parmenio wrote to Alexander from the camp, bidding him have a care of Philip, as one who was bribed by Darius to kill him, with great sums of money and a promise of his daughter in marriage. When he had perused the letter, he put it under his pillow, without showing it so much as to any of his most intimate friends. When Philip came in with the potion, he took it with great cheerfulness and assurance, giving him, meantime, the letter to read. This was a spectacle well worth the present at, to see Alexander take the draught, and Philip read the letter at the same time, and then turn and look upon one another. but with different sentiments, for Alexander's looks were cheerful and open, to show his kindness to and confidence in his physician, while the other was full of surprise and alarm at the accusation, appealing to something as a god or goddess, and, well, a group of them, I guess it's in the plural, probably daimon, or something, to witness his innocence, sometimes lifting up his hands to heaven, and then throwing himself down by the bedside and beseeching Alexander to lay aside all fear and to follow his directions without apprehension. For the medicine at first worked so strongly as to drive, so to say, the vital forces into the interior. He lost his speech, and, falling into a swoon, had scarce any sense or pulse left. However, in no long time, by Philip's means, his health and strength returned, and he showed himself in public to the Macedonians, who were in continual fear and dejection until they saw him abroad again. There was at this time in Darius's army a Macedonian refuge named Amuntus, one who was pretty well acquainted with Alexander's character. This man, when he saw Darius and had to fall upon the enemy in the passes and defiles, advised him earnestly to keep where he was in the open and extensive plains, it being the advantage of a numerous army to have field room enough when it engaged with a lesser force. Darius, instead of taking his counsel, told him that he was afraid the enemy would endeavor to run away, so Alexander would escape out of his hands. That fear, replied Amuntus, is needless, for assure yourself that far from avoiding you, he will make all the speed he can to meet you, and is now most likely on his march towards you. But Amuntus's counsel was to no purpose, for Darius, immediately decamping, marched in Cilicia at the same time that Alexander advanced into Syria to meet him, and, missing one another in the night, they both turned back again. Alexander, greatly pleased with the event, made all the haste he could to fight in the defiles, and Darius to recover his former ground, and draw his army out of so disadvantageous a place. For now he began to perceive his error in engaging himself too far in a country in which the sea, the mountains, and the river Pinarus, running through the midst of it, would necessitate him to divide his forces, render his horse almost unserviceable, and only cover and support the weakness of the enemy. Fortune was not kinder to Alexander in the choice of the ground than he was careful to improve it to his advantage, for being much inferior in numbers, so far from allowing himself to be outflanked, he stretched his right wing much further out than the left wing of his enemies, and fighting there himself in the very foremost ranks, put the barbarians to flight. In this battle he was wounded in the thigh. Carus says that Darius, with whom he fought hand to hand, but the account in which he gave Antipater of the battle, though indeed he owns he was wounded in the thigh with a sword, though not dangerously, and he takes no notice who it was that wounded him. Nothing was wanting to complete this victory, in which he overthrew above 110,000 of his enemies, but taking the person of Darius, who escaped very narrowly by flight, however, having taken the chariot and his bow, he returned from pursuing him, and found his own men busy in pillaging the barbarians' camp, which, though to disburden themselves, they had left most of their baggage at Damascus, was exceedingly rich. But Darius's tent, which was full of splendid furniture and quantities of gold and silver, they reserved for Alexander himself, who, after he had put off his arms, went to bathe himself, saying, "Let us now cleanse ourselves from the toils of war in the bath of Darius." "Not so," replied one of his followers, "but in Alexander's rather, for the property of the conquered is and should be called the conqueror's." Here, when he beheld the bathing vessels, the water pots, the pans, and the ointment boxes, all of gold, curiously wrought, and smelt the fragrant odors with which the whole place was exquisitely perfumed, and from thence passed into a pavilion of great size and height, where the couches and tables and preparations for an entertainment were perfectly magnificent. He turned to those about him and said, "This, it seems, is royalty." But as he was going to supper, word was brought to him that Darius's mother and wife and 2 unmarried daughters, being taken amongst the rest of the prisoners upon the sight of his chariot and bow, were all in mourning and sorrow, imagining him to be dead. After a little pause, more lively affected with their affliction than with his own success, he sent Leonatus to them, to let them know that Darius was not dead, and that they need not fear any harm from Alexander, who made war upon him only for dominion. They should themselves be provided with everything they had been used to receive from Darius. The kind message could not but be very welcome to the captive ladies, especially being made good by actions no less humane and generous, for he gave them leave to bury whom they pleased of the Persians, and to make use of this purpose what garments and furniture they thought fit out of the booty. And of course, it's essential to treat the captives right, but not to this extent is necessary. But he diminished nothing of their equipage, nor the attentions and respect formerly paid them, and allowed their larger pensions for their maintenance than they had before. But the noblest and most royal part of the usage was that he treated these illustrious prisoners according to the virtue and character, not suffering them to hear or receive so much as